On the morning of my wedding, my fiancé stood blindfolded in the hallway of a Chesapeake Bay inn and reached for my hand. He walked right past me. He took my maid of honor's hand instead, and when they pulled the blindfold off and he saw whose fingers he was holding, he didn't let go. He smiled at her and said, "Come on, I'd know her anywhere." The room went so quiet I could hear the photographer's camera clicking. Click, 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 like a clock counting down the last seconds of the life I thought I had. 4 hours later, I canceled my own wedding in front of 130 guests. But I need you to understand something before I tell you the rest. I did not walk away because a man failed a silly party game. I walked away because that game finally made me see, in one single second, what had been happening right in front of my eyes for almost a year. My name is Nora. I was 38 years old that October. And I promise you, the part that changes everything doesn't happen at the wedding. It happens 2.5 years later, when both of them came walking through my door, one at a time, and asked me for something I no longer had to give. Let me start at the beginning. Grant Delaney and I met at a fundraising dinner in Baltimore. He was 34, tall, easy in a room the way some men just are, with a laugh that made strangers turn around and want to be part of whatever was funny. I was 31 and had just started my own consulting business. He asked for my card. He called 4 days later. 6 years after that, he proposed on the back porch of his parents' house on Christmas Eve with his whole family watching, and I said yes before he finished the sentence. I want to be honest about who I was back then because it matters. I was the woman who handled things. If somebody got sick, I made the casseroles and the phone calls. If a friend had a flat tire at 11 at night, I got in the car. It's how my mother raised me, and it's how I understood love, as something you prove by carrying weight. So when we got engaged, I carried the wedding. We chose an inn on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake, an old white clapboard place with a lawn running down to the water and a 100-year-old oak at the edge of it. We had 10 months. In those 10 months, I handled the room block, the caterer, the rentals, the shuttles, the seating chart, the rehearsal dinner, the music, and a 2-page document about which of Grant's elderly relatives needed a ground floor room. Grant said work was too demanding for him to get into the small things. The small things apparently included his own aunt's hotel room. I told myself it was fine, because in a way it was. Planning was what I did for a living. It was genuinely faster to do it myself than to ask him 5 separate times and then be told I was micromanaging him. That's the thing about being competent. People let you be. Renee Calloway was my maid of honor. We met the first week of our sophomore year of college, assigned to the same apartment with a radiator that clanked and a kitchen table that wobbled if either of us leaned on it. We split boxes of spaghetti when money was thin. We stayed up until the sky went gray, studying for exams neither of us was ready for. When we were 22, standing in a parking lot after graduation, we promised we'd stand up in each other's weddings no matter what happened. And when my mother died, I was 33. It was fast. It was pancreatic. We had 11 weeks. Renee slept on my couch for almost a month because I could not stand the sound of my own apartment. She answered the phone when I couldn't talk. She brought groceries I forgot to eat. She knew which stories about my mother would make me laugh instead of come apart. 14 years, that friendship. I believed that if every other person in my life walked out the door, Renee would still be sitting at my kitchen table. Hold on to that, because everything that comes next only hurts as much as it does because of that. Now, the rehearsal dinner. Friday evening before the wedding, out on the stone terrace behind the inn. String lights over the tables, both families, the whole wedding party, 30 guests who'd flown in early. The air smelled like salt and rosemary. Everybody had that loose, relieved feeling people get when the hard part is almost over. Halfway through dinner, my cousin Lily and the MC announced a little couples game. Nothing elaborate. 2 whiteboards, 2 markers. The kind of thing that gets 3 minutes of laughs and a nice photo. I want to be clear, Renee did not write those questions. She only handed out the boards and stepped back beside the MC with a glass of wine. She had no idea what was coming, neither did I. First question, what is Nora's favorite dessert? I wrote sour cherry pie. It was my mother's. She made it every 4th of July in a yellow ceramic dish with a chip on the rim, and every year she said the same thing, that a store-bought crust was a sin and a lattice top was just showing off. After she died, I made it once, badly, and cried in the kitchen with flour on my hands. Grant knew that. I would have sworn on my life that Grant knew that. We turned our boards at the same time. Mine said sour cherry pie. His said key lime. The table laughed the way people laugh when a groom gets one wrong at his own rehearsal dinner, warm, forgiving, a little smug on behalf of every woman in the room. Grant shrugged and said, nerves. But over by the MC, Renee's smile stopped moving, just for a fraction of a second, just long enough. Key lime was Renee's favorite. She ordered it at every restaurant that had it. She had a running joke about it. She lifted her wine glass and said, bright and easy, well, at least somebody remembers mine. Everybody laughed again. It was funny. It was genuinely funny. I smiled, too, because one wrong answer means nothing. Second question. What food can Nora absolutely not eat? I wrote sesame. Grant wrote strawberries. Renee is allergic to strawberries, has been since she was a child, carries the pen for it. The laughter that time was thinner. Somebody in the back said, ooh, the way you do at a ball game when a pitch goes wild. The MC jumped in, sounds like the groom's got homework tonight, folks, and it should have blown right over. Except Grant's face changed. He wasn't embarrassed. He was irritated. He said, Nora eats everything. I can't be expected to memorize every ingredient in the world. I didn't say anything. Because 2 months earlier, at a business dinner in Annapolis, a waiter had nearly set a dessert in front of me made with tahini. Renee was the one who caught it. She put her hand on that waiter's arm and said, no, not that one. She can't have sesame. And Grant had been sitting right beside me when it happened. Third question. What does Grant have Nora saved, as in his phone? I picked up the marker and hesitated, and I remember feeling almost shy, like I was about to share something private. I wrote Bertie. He'd called me that since our second date, after I told him my mother used to call me her little bird because I never sat still. Grant didn't hesitate at all. He wrote one word in big block letters and turned his board around before I did. Duchess. My hand stopped moving. Grant had never once in 6 years called me Duchess. Duchess was what everyone had called Renee since college, since the night she wore a thrift store fur coat to a party and refused to take it off for 4 hours. It was in her email signature. Her sister had it embroidered on a Christmas stocking. For 1 full second, all the color went out of Renee's face. I watched it happen. Then she picked up her wine glass and looked out at the water like she'd heard something interesting in the dark. Grant flipped his board face down and said, loud enough for the front tables, all right, that's enough. It's a game. Let's not make it weird. He said it looking at me, as if the discomfort in that room were something I had done. The MC moved on fast. Somebody's uncle told a story about a fishing boat. The moment closed over itself the way moments do. But across the terrace, Grant and Renee looked at each other. I saw it, and I've thought about it 10,000 times since. It was not two people confused by a coincidence. It was not two people embarrassed. It was fast, and it was flat, and it was two people silently asking each other, did anyone just see that? That's the look of a secret checking whether it's still hidden. Later, up in our suite, I asked him. He was pulling off his tie. Nora, 3 questions. I got all 3 wrong. 2 of them happened to line up with Renee. That's it. Then explained Duchess. Why did you write her nickname down as mine? His hands paused at his collar. Half a second. Because she says it constantly. It's in my head. Then tell me what you know about me. 6 years. And you don't remember the thing that could put me in an emergency room. And there it was, that expression I'd been managing for years, the tightening around the eyes. Are you seriously picking a fight over a party game the night before our wedding? Now, I want to say something to the women listening who are around my age, because some of you already know exactly what that sentence does. Grant had a version of that question for everything. Whenever I raised a concern, the concern stopped being the subject. I became the subject. I was too sensitive. I expected too much. I always brought things up at the worst possible time. And every single time, I ended up apologizing because keeping the peace always felt more urgent than being right. It took me years to understand that he had not failed to see my worth. He saw it perfectly. He depended on it, on the way I ran our life, paid the bills, called his mother on her birthday, opened doors he couldn't open himself. And the more he needed me, the more he needed to make me small. Because a man who resents needing you will find a way to punish you for it. That night I didn't apologize. I said, I just want to know what's going on. He said, "Nothing is going on. 130 people are here for us tomorrow. Don't let your anxiety wreck this." Then he took his phone out onto the balcony and shut the door. I sat on the edge of that enormous bed and watched the screen light up his face through the glass. Once, twice, 4 times. He typed something, and then he smiled down at his phone, and something cold moved through my chest. I told myself I could not throw away 6 years over a whiteboard. I slept maybe 2 hours. At 7 the next morning, the bridesmaids came in with coffee and garment bags and curling irons. The photographer moved around the edges, getting the candid shots that only look effortless because somebody planned every second of them. Renee came in carrying a tray of lattes like nothing on this earth was wrong. She put her arms around me and said, "Big day." She smelled like orange blossom. I had never once noticed her perfume before that week. That morning I could smell it in every corner of the room. Around 9, the groomsmen brought Grant up to the hallway. Here's something you need to know. The find the bride bit was not Renee's idea, and it wasn't Grant's. My cousin Lily put it on the photography shot list weeks earlier. It's a trend. You've probably seen the videos. The groom gets blindfolded and has to find his bride by her hand, then by her voice, and everybody laughs, and it goes online, and it's sweet. Nobody planned what happened. They lined 4 of us up in that hallway. A bridesmaid named Tessa first, me second, Renee third, then Grant's cousin Dana. The photographer told him no peeking and started rolling. He took Tessa's hand for 2 seconds and moved on. He took mine. His fingers rested against my palm, and I remember thinking, here it comes, here's the part where he says my name and everybody cheers, and then he let go and moved on. He let go of my hand. He stopped at Renee, and he didn't just hold her hand. His finger slid from her palm to the inside of her wrist, and his thumb came to rest on a spot there, a small mole, maybe the size of a pencil point, like he knew exactly where to find it, like he had found it 100 times before in the dark without looking. Then he closed his hand around hers, and she squeezed back. Before she could stop herself, she squeezed back. It was too fast to be manners, too natural to be a guess. It was the reflex of 2 bodies that have learned each other somewhere private. They took the blindfold off. For half a second his face just locked, like a man whose foot has gone through a rotten stair. Then he laughed and said, "No way, that's rigged." A few people laughed with him. I didn't. The photographer. God bless that woman. She was maybe 26, and she read that room faster than anybody in it, said, "Let's jump ahead to the voice round," and moved us all out of there. For the voice round, each of us had recorded the same sentence a week before. 3 words. I'm right here. They played 4 clips. He picked the 3rd one almost before it finished. It was Renee. Pulled off the blindfold, saw her standing in front of him in her dusty blue bridesmaid dress, and smiled. This warm, private, delighted smile, and said, "Come on, I'd know her anywhere." Nobody moved. I watched his face as he heard his own sentence land in the silence. I watched him understand what he had said, and who he had said it about in front of 11 people and a camera. "I meant Nora," he said fast. "Obviously I meant Nora." The photographer lowered her camera and said quietly, "But that wasn't Nora." Every face in that room turned toward me. I was sitting at the vanity with my veil already pinned into my hair. And here's the part I still can't fully explain. In the mirror I looked completely composed, calm, a little pale, like a photograph of a bride. And inside, the anger just drained out of me. All of it. My mind went very, very quiet. And into that quiet, the last 10 months came walking back one by one. Grant's business trips, which had roughly tripled since spring, Renee knowing his travel schedule before I did. Oh, isn't he in Richmond this week? And me not even noticing. The 2 of them using the same odd little phrase at dinner, 3 weeks apart, a phrase neither of them had ever used before. Renee mentioning the new lamps in our bedroom, and when I frowned, she laughed and said I must have sent her a picture. I never sent her a picture. One of those people was the man I was supposed to marry in 7 hours. The other was the woman who slept on my couch for a month so I wouldn't be alone after my mother died. It had honestly never occurred to me that I might need protecting from both of them at once. Now, a lot of people would have started screaming right there. I understand that, but let me tell you why I didn't, because it turned out to be the most important decision I made that day. If I had confronted them with nothing but a game and a feeling, here's exactly what happens. Grant says wedding stress has made me irrational. Renee cries, and she cries beautifully, she always has, and says I've misunderstood everything. My future mother-in-law takes my hands and tells me not to throw away a marriage over nerves. And by 2 o'clock, somebody is telling me a nice glass of wine would help. I needed the truth in my hands before other people started deciding which version of it was most convenient for everyone. So I said, I need a minute, and the room cleared out in 90 seconds. Everyone was relieved to have somewhere else to look. Renee stayed longest. She stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame and said, Nora. I said, can you go check the ceremony flowers? They were supposed to be set by 9. And she went. She actually went. Now, the tablet. We had a wedding tablet. I'd bought it 8 months earlier. It held the master timeline, the vendor contacts, the seating chart, the music cues. It was mine. The night before, Renee had signed into her messages on it so she could get updates from the florist and the shuttle company. Perfectly reasonable. I'd told her to. Notification previews were on. I want to be honest about what I did and did not do, because it mattered later and it matters to me now. I did not open her messages. I never unlocked her account. I did not go digging through my best friend's private conversations. What I did was open the wedding email, my account, in my name, because the inn had sent the final master folio that morning, and I wanted the charges. I went through it line by line, the way I'd gone through 1,000 folios for clients. Room block, catering, terrace rental, shuttle, chairs. And near the bottom, an accommodation charge from 2 months earlier. 2 months earlier, Grant told me he needed to drive out to the shore alone for a night to walk the property and sign a couple of vendor documents. I was grateful. I remember being grateful. He'd booked a king room under our group code, and I assumed it was part of that trip and never thought about it again. The folio listed the second registered guest on that room, Renee Calloway. I sat there in my wedding dress and remembered that date perfectly because it was the night I couldn't reach either of them. Grant texted back one word, busy, and Renee sent me a photograph of a hotel breakfast, waffles, a little pot of jam, and complained that business travel was lonely. And I texted back that once the wedding was over, we were finally taking a girls' trip. There was one coffee cup in that picture. Just one. My hands went cold. Not shaking, cold. I forwarded that folio to my personal email and to my father's, and then I photographed the screen with my phone because in my business you learn that documents disappear. And that is when a message preview slid down from the top of the tablet. From Grant. Is she starting to put it together? And 6 seconds later, Renee's reply. You promised. After she gets you in front of the Calvert people and the deal closes, you end it. Stop being careless. I understood then that Renee had not gone downstairs to check the flowers. She had gone to find him, to ask him what in God's name he thought he was doing in that hallway. And the two of them were standing somewhere in that beautiful old inn, in a bridesmaid dress and a rented tuxedo, arguing on their phones, and every line of it was landing on my tablet one preview at a time. A few more hours, he wrote. Then, once she walks me into that committee meeting, I don't have to keep pretending. Then, I lost my head last night and again this morning because all I can think about is you. I didn't need another word. Now let me explain the committee because that's what turns this from a sad story into something colder. For years I'd run an independent hospitality consulting practice with long relationships with boutique hotel groups up and down the Mid-Atlantic. One of them, I'll call them Calvert, was starting a waterfront development and they trusted me. That trust took 11 years to build. Grant had asked me 4 separate times to introduce his firm to Calvert. 4 separate times I said no, not because I didn't love him, but because his company hadn't finished its environmental review. Its financials had a hole you could drive a truck through, and my name would have been on that introduction forever. He told me I didn't support him. He told me once that some people are just afraid of other people's success. He needed my connections, and he hated that he needed them. Standing there with the folio in one hand and the tablet in the other, I finally understood why he was so determined to get to that altar. He was sleeping with my best friend, he was planning to leave, and he still didn't want to lose me, not yet. He wanted the ring on my finger and the access that came with it. And Renee was not waiting for him to choose between us. Renee was waiting for him to use me first. Both of them had made the same calculation, that once I was in the dress, once the deposits were spent and the guests were seated and his grandmother had flown in from Ohio, I would swallow anything rather than face that lawn. They were about to learn something about me that I didn't fully know myself. I called the inn's event manager. Her name was Diane. 19 years in that job. She was up in that suite in 4 minutes. I laid it out flat, the way I would have for a client. I was the primary signer on every contract. The deposits and the master account were on my cards. The marriage license had not been signed. I wanted Grant's authorization removed from the account, and I wanted the ceremony stopped. Then I told her the part I'd already decided. I did not cancel the guest rooms. I did not cancel dinner. 130 people had flown into Maryland, taken time off work, bought gifts, gotten their hair done. My 81-year-old great-aunt had come from Michigan with a lemon cake in her carry-on. Not one of those people had done anything wrong. Diane looked at me, at the dress and the veil and the folio in my hand. She said, "Honey, are you sure?" I looked at myself in the mirror. Yes. It is the most certain word I have ever said in my life. At 4 o'clock, the guests were seated on the lawn under that 100-year-old oak. Grant stood under the arch in a dark suit with a white lisianthus bâtonnière that I had personally chosen from 4 options in a florist shop in Easton. From a distance, he still looked exactly like the man I'd been picturing for 6 years. That's the part nobody warned you about. The string trio started. Everyone turned. And I came out of that inn in my wedding dress with no bouquet in my hands and no arm through my father's. My dad was standing just inside the entrance. Walter, 71 years old, in the only suit he owned. He'd known something was wrong since 10 that morning because I'd asked him to hold my phone. He said quietly, "You sure you want to go out there alone?" I said, "This time I have to." He didn't argue. He just squeezed my hand hard enough to hurt. I walked down that aisle, and I did not walk toward Grant. I stopped in front of the guests. I said, "Before we begin, there's something you all need to see." There was a sound across that lawn like wind through leaves, 130 people inhaling at the same time. Grant came at me fast. "Nora, don't." "Why not?" "This isn't the time to discuss." "You're right," I said. "I'm not going to discuss it in private." The screen by the reception tent came on. My cousin Lily was at the laptop with tears running down her face, and she pressed play anyway. That girl gets a Christmas present from me every year for the rest of her life. The video played. Grant, blindfolded, letting go of my hand. Grant stopping at Renee, his thumb finding that mole on the inside of her wrist, her fingers closing around his. And then his voice carrying across that whole lawn out of 2 rented speakers. Come on, I'd know her anywhere. The clip ended. Renee stood up out of the bridesmaids' row, the color of paper. "Nora, it was a game." Then Diane put up the folio. The room charge from 2 months earlier, both names on it, billed to my account. And then the screenshot. Nobody made a sound. I have been in rooms with 1,000 people in them, and I have never heard silence like that. Grant got right up next to me and lowered his voice. He went through our messages. Even then, his first instinct wasn't, "I'm sorry." It wasn't, "How could I?" It was, "How did you find out?" I said, "They appeared on my tablet, and the hotel charge was on my credit card. We can handle this privately." "You've been handling it privately for a long time. I'm handling it publicly." Renee started crying. "I never meant to hurt you." And I finally turned and looked at her. "You fixed my veil at my last fitting. You held my hand at the florist and told me my mother would have loved the cherry blossoms. Every single time I got scared about getting married, you sat across from me and told me Grant was a good man." Her mouth was shaking. "You knew exactly where to hurt me. You just thought that if I found out late enough, I'd be too ashamed to leave. 14 years? And she didn't have one word. I took a bouquet out of the nearest bridesmaid's hands and laid it on the empty chair in front of Renee. "From last night to this morning," I said, "every time he was asked to choose, he chose you." Then I turned to Grant. "But you don't actually want to marry her either. You want what she gives you, and you want the stability and the clients and the credibility that I give you. You were never torn between 2 women. You just believed you were entitled to both." His father, in the second row, looked down at the grass and did not look up again. My dad started to stand, and Grant grabbed my arm and said, "You're going to regret this the second you walk off this lawn." Dad took one step forward. I shook my head at him, because I loved him for it, but I needed to finish this myself. I looked down at Grant's hand on my arm. I didn't say anything. I just looked at it, and after about 4 seconds he let go. I turned back to the guest. "The wedding is canceled. Dinner will still be served. The rooms are still yours. You came a long way, and you shouldn't have to pay for their choices, but there will be no marriage today." I took off my engagement ring and set it on the welcome table, next to the seating chart I'd made. Grant said, "You're running away from your own wedding." I said, "No, I'm stopping a fraud before it becomes a marriage." And I walked off that lawn. Nobody clapped. There was no cheering. That only happens in movies. There was wind off the water and the sound of my dress dragging on flagstones, and somewhere behind me a woman crying, and that was all. My father followed. He didn't rush me, and he didn't ask a single question. At the door, he took off his suit jacket and put it around my shoulders. He said, "Let's go home." And I looked out past the parking lot at the road and said, "Dad, I don't know where that is anymore." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Then take your time finding it." The next 2 months were the strangest of my life. And I'll be honest, the wedding was not the hard part. The after was the hard part. My phone did not stop. Some people were wonderful. Some thought what I'd done on that lawn was cruel and said so. 4 different people asked me to please just hear their side, as though the right explanation might turn all of it into a misunderstanding about a hotel booking. I muted almost all of them, not because I was numb, because every message put me right back on that lawn. Dad helped me clear out the apartment Grant and I had rented in Baltimore. That was a bad day. The dining table was the first thing we bought together after the engagement. There was still a dent in the couch cushion in the exact shape of him. I gave away almost everything. I kept my clothes, my laptop, my files, and 2 things my father carried to the car himself, my mother's rolling pin and the chipped yellow pie dish. He set them on the back seat and said, "These go with you." And then I did something completely out of character for a woman who had spent her whole adult life planning things. I got in the car and drove to northern Michigan. I'd been to Traverse City exactly once, 9 years earlier, for a client site visit. I remembered water, the color of a swimming pool, cherry orchards, an old movie theater downtown, and people standing around in ordinary winter coats waiting for bread on a Saturday morning. Mostly I remembered that nobody there knew me. Nobody there knew I had walked off a lawn in a wedding dress. I rented a 1-bedroom over a garage, small windows, cabinets painted about 9 times. The first night I ate takeout on the floor because I hadn't unpacked a chair. I expected to feel free. What I felt was an enormous, echoing emptiness. No shoes by the door. No keys hitting the counter. Nobody asking what the plan was for dinner. I sat between 2 boxes and folded over my knees and cried until my ribs hurt. And I want to tell you what I was crying about, because it wasn't him. I was crying because I could finally admit how much of myself I'd handed over to keep that relationship comfortable. I'd let a job I loved go part-time because Grant said my travel made it hard to build a life. I'd stopped calling friends because it was easier than explaining. And every time we fought, my first thought had been, what can I do to make this easier for him? I almost never asked whether any of it was fair to me. The next morning my father called. He didn't ask if I cried, and he didn't ask when I was coming home. He said, "Eat some breakfast." Then he called every Sunday, sometimes 8 minutes. He'd tell me about the weather in Maryland, and I'd tell him about the snow. He never once made me talk about the wedding. That restraint was the kindest thing anybody did for me that whole year. I kept taking remote consulting work to cover rent, and at the end of every day I walked. That's how I found the bakery. It sat on a side street off the main drag, between a used bookstore and a storefront that had been 4 different businesses in 5 years. Faded sign, good smell, and a card taped inside the glass, handwritten, "Closing at the end of the month, owner retiring." The bell over the door made a soft, flat sound. Behind the counter was a woman in her 70s, with white hair pinned up in flour on her forearms. Ilse Pedersen. She and her husband had opened that bakery 33 years earlier. He'd died 6 years back. She'd kept it alone since, and now her daughter in Minneapolis wanted her closer. She said, "Looking for something?" I meant to say a loaf of rye. What came out was, "Are you really closing?" She looked at me a good 5 seconds. Then, "Unless somebody wants it." I had spent 15 years planning events. I knew logistics, sourcing, margins, and how a room should feel when people walk into it. I had never run a retail shop in my life, and I could not make a decent pie crust. I did not offer to buy it, but I went back. Every week for 2 months, sometimes I bought a loaf, sometimes I stayed 45 minutes and talked to Ilse about her husband, or about my mother, or about nothing at all. And then, the week before Christmas, one of her 2 employees got the flu on the same morning at church, called in an order for 200 rolls and 8 pies for a funeral luncheon. I stayed and helped. We worked 13 hours. Somewhere after midnight, I was sitting on the floor of the stockroom crimping crust with my thumbs, my back aching, flour in my hair, and I realized it was the first full day since the wedding that I had not thought about Grant Delaney one single time. When the last pie went out, Ilse wiped her hands and said, "So, have you actually thought about taking it?" That time I didn't laugh it off. Over the next 6 weeks I went through the lease, the supplier agreements, and 3 years of sales records and paid a local accountant to check the book. The place wasn't drowning, but foot traffic was down almost 40%. The website hadn't been touched in years, and there was no wholesale business at all. I couldn't buy it outright. Ilse offered to seller finance. I'd take the lease and buy the equipment up front, then pay the rest over 2 years. I kept part of my consulting work so I wouldn't live or die on bread sales in year 1. When I explained it to my father, he was quiet a long time. Then he said, "Are you sure you're not just running into a new life because the old one hurt?" It was the first time he'd asked me anything directly. I said, "I'm not sure, but when I'm in that building, I don't feel like I'm running." He never tried to stop me again. The morning the transfer went through, a package arrived from Maryland. Inside was my mother's rolling pin, which I'd left at his house on purpose because I couldn't look at it, and a note in his handwriting for the second one. I named the bakery at 2 in the morning with a pencil and a napkin. Second rise, because that's what bread does. You knead it and let it rise, and then you punch it back down. You knock the air out of it on purpose, and you let it rise again, and the second rise is the one that gives it the crumb. The second rise is the one that makes it good. Now, I don't want to make the next part sound romantic, because it was not. First week, almost nobody came. I was at the wholesale market before 5, mixing by 6, on my feet till 4, rebuilding the website at night. Some days I sold 11 loaves. At the end of that week, I looked in the compost bin and realized I'd thrown away more than I'd sold. I sat down on an overturned crate and genuinely wondered if I'd made the second biggest mistake of my life. Alice came by that afternoon for a photo album she'd left in the back. She looked in the bin and frowned. "You made too much." I was scared people would come in and there'd be nothing left. When nobody's coming in, more choices just means more garbage. Then she took off her coat and helped me redo the whole production schedule. And she told me something I've repeated to every person who's ever worked for me. A bakery is not a wedding. At a wedding, everything has to be perfect for one day. A bakery has to give people a reason to come back on a Tuesday. I asked her how you do that. She pointed out the window at the street. Start by knowing your neighbors. So the next morning I put the unsold loaves in a basket and walked that block and introduced myself. Not a pitch. Just my name and a loaf of bread. Dean, who ran the coffee shop on the corner, offered to carry my pastries and split it. The bookstore next door offered its back room on Saturdays for classes. A diner 2 streets over needed pie, real pie, 6 a week, year-round. None of it was big. Together, it was the difference between a business and a hobby. Then I started a bread club. $12 a week, standing loaf, pick up Thursday. The first month I had 9 members, 9. I wrote down every preference in a notebook. One woman couldn't have walnuts. One man ordered a cherry pie the same week every year. And the third year he finally told me it was his wife's birthday, and she'd been gone since 2011. I learned their names. They learned mine. About 4 months in, a young woman came in and asked me to make the dessert table for her wedding. She opened a folder of pictures on the counter, and my hand stopped. Sour cherry, lattice top, the exact pie I'd planned to serve at my own reception. Can you do it? Every part of me wanted to say no. That night I dreamed I was back on that lawn with the oak behind me and Renee holding my bouquet, everyone staring at me like I was the one who ruined the day. I woke at 3 in the morning and sat at my kitchen table with her folder open in front of me. And here's what I finally understood. Sour cherry pie did not belong to Grant. It never had. It belonged to a yellow dish with a chipped rim, and a 4th of July, and a woman with flour to her elbows telling me a lattice top was showing off. If I gave up every flavor and every song and every place that wedding had touched, those two would own all of it forever. They'd get my mother's pie. They'd get October. I was not going to pay them that. I took the job. Of course, that week my flour came 2 days late, and the walk-in cooler died the night before. I didn't have time to fall apart. I found a dairy that would sell me cream direct, borrowed cooler space from a restaurant that owed me a favor, and adjusted 2 items without changing how the table looked. I was there at 4:30 in the morning, and my hand shook a little setting the last pie down. When she saw it, she put both hands over her mouth and said, "That's exactly it." During the ceremony, I was outside packing crates, and I could see the aisle through the trees. She came down it on her father's arm toward a man who looked at her like there was nobody else on the property. And I didn't fall apart. I wasn't jealous either. I stood there with a crate on my hip and understood something simple and enormous. Somebody else's happiness is not evidence of my failure. My wedding didn't happen. My life didn't end there. 6 months after Second Rising opened, an old friend sent me a photo. Grant and Renee, married, City Hall in Baltimore, a short white dress, white roses, his hand at her waist. The caption said, "Some love stories just take the long way around." I looked at that sentence a long time. They had rewritten it. In their version, it wasn't betrayal. It was destiny with bad timing. Getting married afterward turned every lie into a kind of courage. That night, I opened Renee's page for the first time since I'd left Maryland. The ring, the new apartment, weekend trips, breakfast he'd supposedly made her. Every picture looked aimed at an audience she needed to convince. I looked for about 10 minutes. Then I closed it and unfollowed both of them. That wasn't revenge. I was just finished letting 2 people I never intended to see again decide what kind of day I was going to have. After that, I only heard fragments. Grant's firm had a project stall out. Renee posted less. The polished couple photos kept coming, but the gaps between them got longer. I stopped asking. My own life had gotten very specific, and specific is another word for good. The week before Valentine's Day, my one part-time girl and I worked until 1 in the morning. In spring, we ran our first sold-out class. In August, a storm canceled the farmer's market, and I turned $400 of berries into hand pies and drove them to every office downtown. And then, right when I believed the worst was behind me, my landlord informed me the rent was going up 35% at renewal. I sat up all night with that letter. Second Rising had only just turned consistently profitable. If I signed and changed nothing, a whole year of work would evaporate. Elle said move, go out by the highway where rent is half. But leaving meant leaving Dean's coffee shop, and the bookstore, and the diner, and 11 blocks of people who knew my name. The relationships were the business. The building was just a building. So instead, I rebuilt what the business actually was. I cut the big custom cake work, which ate labor and paid poorly. I expanded the bread club and went after standing corporate orders. I moved the classes permanently into the bookstore's back room and let Dean handle the coffee for a cut so I never had to become a cafe. And I set up a weekly delivery to the family lounge at the regional medical center for people sitting long shifts with somebody they love. Within 4 months, the subscriptions and classes covered the whole increase. I went back to the landlord and offered 5 years instead of 3 for a smaller bump. And he took it. The night I signed, I locked the door and stood on the sidewalk in the rain with the key in my hand and realized I hadn't thought about Grant Delaney in weeks. No music, nothing dramatic. Traverse City had simply stopped being the place I ran to. It was home. About a year after they married, Renee emailed me. The subject line was 2 words, "I'm sorry." It was long. She said she was pregnant. She said the marriage she was posting online did not resemble the one she was living in. Grant's firm was under real pressure, and he had started comparing her to me, constantly. Nora knew how to run a budget. Nora never made things difficult when I was busy. If Nora were still here, she'd have gotten me in front of Calvert by now. Renee wrote, I used to think he talked about you because he still loved you. I understand now that he just misses having someone carry his life for him. And then she wrote the part I didn't expect. She said love hadn't been the only reason. Jealousy had been just as much of it. She had envied my business. She had envied that I'd had a mother who called me her little bird. And she had envied more than anything that Grant had chosen to marry me in public, in front of everybody. When he wanted me, it felt like the first time I'd ever beaten you at anything. And at the end, I didn't only lose you, I lost the version of me that hadn't done this yet. I read it twice. I didn't answer. I believed every word of her regret. Regret and trust are just not the same currency. 2 weeks later, she was standing outside my bakery in the rain. Loose coat, clearly pregnant. For maybe 4 minutes she stood on that sidewalk like she couldn't decide whether she had the right to touch the door. Then the bell rang. We hadn't seen each other in almost 2 years. She was thin everywhere except the middle, with dark hollows under her eyes. She said, Nora? I didn't welcome her, but I didn't put her out in the rain either. I poured her a glass of water and sat her at the table by the window. She looked around at the shelves and the case. It's beautiful. Did you do all this yourself? I said, no. A lot of people helped me. Then she started to apologize, and at first the apologies still had explanations hiding inside them. It started as just talking. She didn't expect it to become what it became. She'd wanted to tell me before the wedding and never found the courage. I let her go until she said I never wanted it to turn into all this. And I said, but every single time you crossed another line, you knew exactly what you were doing. She started to cry, and she said, I know. She didn't argue. That was new. She said she missed our friendship. She missed the apartment with the clanking radiator. She missed the 3 weeks after my mother died. And then she put her hand flat on her stomach and said, when she's born, I thought maybe you could be her godmother. I looked at her a long moment. Why would you think I'd want that? 'Cause of who we were. And here's what I said to her. It took me 2 years to be able to say it. You don't just want forgiveness, you want me to be the person who catches you again, the one who carries whatever you can't. The tears were coming down her face. The reason you were able to hurt me that badly is that we were that close. You knew precisely where the soft parts were, and you went there on purpose. She looked at the table. I accept that you're telling the truth now. I don't want anything bad to happen to you, and I don't want anything bad to happen to your baby. But accepting an apology is not the same as opening my life back up. Our friendship isn't a plate you can break and then set back on the shelf because you finally said you were sorry. She said, is there any chance at all, ever? I said, no, because I remembered the 20-year-old who drove to an all-night pharmacy in a snowstorm when I had a fever of 103. And I also remembered the 37-year-old who fixed my veil while waiting for a text from my fiancé. Both of those women were Renee. I could not keep one and pretend the other never existed. Before she left, I wrapped up a small loaf of the cardamom bread she used to love in college and put it in her hands. She looked down at it like it meant something more. I said, it's a goodbye. She carried it out into the rain, and I watched from behind the window until she turned the corner. I did not feel like I'd won anything. I felt sad and tired, and I went and started the afternoon dough. Sometimes not hating someone anymore just means you stop carrying them. It does not mean it's safe to let them back in. About 7 months later, a mutual friend called me at the shop. Renee had been rushed to the hospital with severe complications. They'd had to deliver far too early. The baby didn't live. I was tying a ribbon on a birthday box when I got that call, and my hands just stopped. That child had done nothing to anybody. Whatever Renee had done to me, that was not a bill anyone was owed. I didn't call her, not because I felt nothing. I sat in my car in the alley for 20 minutes. But because showing up in the worst hour of someone's life sends a message that the door has reopened, and it hadn't. That would have been a kindness that turned into a cruelty 6 months later. I asked our friend to tell her I was deeply sorry, and that I hoped she'd let people take care of her. 3 months after that, a handwritten letter came. She didn't ask me to forgive her. She wrote that after the baby died, every unresolved thing in that marriage came up through the floor at once. She needed Grant to grieve with her. He worked 80-hour weeks instead. Every conversation about their daughter ended in blame. And in their worst fight, Grant had said, "If I'd never left Nora, my life wouldn't look like this." Renee wrote, "That was the moment I finally understood that it doesn't matter who he's with. He will never take responsibility for a single choice he's made. He blames me for his career, for the life you built that he lost, and now for the fact that he doesn't know how to grieve. But I can't put all of it on him. I chose to hurt you, and I chose to marry a man who had already proven exactly what he was willing to do to someone who loved him." They were separating. She was leaving social media, moving back to her parents' town in Ohio, and starting therapy. The last lines were, "You don't have to answer. This time I just wanted to tell the truth. I'm not trading an apology for anything." I put the letter in the drawer under the register, and that evening I made a batch of small white rolls and set them in the front window with a card that just said, "For a little one." They weren't for Renee. They weren't a celebration of anybody's marriage ending. They were for a baby who never got a chance at anything at all. That loss changed what I thought a bakery could be for. A few months later, I partnered with a women's shelter in town and started a free class one Saturday a month. Some of the women were divorced, some had buried a husband, some had spent 15 years taking care of a parent and were only beginning to remember they were a person. I never told them my story. I just stood next to them with my sleeves pushed up and showed them how to knead, how you knock the air out of it on purpose, how you let it come back. Grant came to Michigan when Second Rising had been open 2.5 years. It was a Saturday class. I was at the front counter showing 4 women how to tell when a dough is properly proofed, and the bell over the door rang, and I looked up, and there he was. He'd lost weight. The suit was still expensive, but it hung off his shoulders wrong. He stood in my shop looking around at my life. And here's what struck me hardest. Nobody in that room knew who he was. In that town, he wasn't my fiancé. He wasn't the groom from a ruined wedding. He was just a man in a suit who didn't belong in a bakery on a Saturday morning. When the class ended, I sent my employees home. He sat down at the window table. "You actually opened a bakery." "I did. It looks like it's doing well." "It is." And I could see my calm bothering him more than anything I could have said. Because for 6 years, the second Grant walked into a room, I had started reading his mood the way you check the sky before a picnic. Is he tired? Is he annoyed? What do I need to do? Now I sat in my own shop with flour on my apron and waited for him to get to the point. He said, "Renee and I are divorced." "I know, she wrote to me. That's between the two of you." He was quiet a while. Then, "Nora, I made a mistake." "You made a lot of them." He put his head down. "I know. I didn't understand how good our life was until everything came apart." "Was it good?" He looked up, honestly surprised. "Of course it was." "For you," I said. "Somebody remembered your schedule. Somebody paid the bills and called your mother on her birthday and got you in front of clients you couldn't reach on your own and apologized first every time you were in a bad mood." I held his eyes. "For me, that relationship required getting a little smaller every year so you could stay comfortable." "I can change." "Why now?" "Because I finally know who I really love." And I asked him the only question that mattered. "Do you love me, or do you miss the life I used to run for you?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He said, "I could move here, sell everything, move up here, and we start over." I said, "This was never a geography problem." "We had 6 years, Nora." And he spent a good part of them teaching me that my needs were an inconvenience. He said, "You never used to be this cold." And I almost smiled because I finally had the answer ready. "You're right. I used to put understanding everybody else above protecting myself. I'm not going back to being that woman." He stood up. "So there's nothing I can do." "There's plenty you can do. You can change. You can learn to take responsibility. You can stop handing other people the bill for your own choices. You can become an honest man." Something like hope crossed his face, and I hated to do it, but I finished the sentence. "And whatever life you build after you do, all that will not include me." He stood there a long moment in the middle of my shop. Finally he said, "Do you really have no regrets? None?" I thought about it. He'd asked a real question, so I gave him a real answer. I regret not seeing it sooner. I regret how many pieces of myself I gave away to keep something alive that wasn't, but I have never once, not for a single hour, regretted canceling that wedding. He left. It was raining, the way it always seems to be in the parts of this story that matter. He didn't turn around, and I didn't walk him out. The bell rang once, and the shop was quiet. I went back to the counter and finished shaping the afternoon batch, and my hands were completely steady. A year later, Second Rising opened a second location out by the water. I want to be careful here, because I know how these stories usually end, and mine doesn't end that way. I did not become famous, I did not build an empire, and I did not meet some wealthy, handsome man whose attention proved I'd been worth keeping all along. What I have is 2 small shops, a team of 6 people I trust with my keys, and a few hundred customers who come back every week because somewhere along the line we became part of each other's ordinary lives. My father flew out for the opening. He's 76 now, and he walks slower than he used to. He stood in front of the window where my mother's yellow pie dish sits on a shelf with a lattice-topped cherry pie in it every Friday, and he looked at it a long time. He said, "She'd have liked this." I said, "I like it too." I still run the free class every month. And after one of them, a woman about 55 stayed behind to help me wipe down tables, and she asked why I'd named it Second Rising. I looked over at that yellow dish in the window, and I told her that for a long time I believed cherry pie would only ever remind me of a wedding that didn't happen, that now it reminds me of my mother and of a life I built starting from an empty apartment and a bakery 3 weeks from closing. I told her that most people believe you only get one rise, you pick a career at 22, you marry somebody at 30, you build a family, and if it turns out wrong, well, that's that. You made your bed. But dough doesn't work that way. You knock all the air out of it on purpose with your fist. You cover it and you wait and it comes back. She said, "Does the second one look like the first?" I shook my head. No. It takes longer, it's usually a little uneven, but it's the one with the good crumb, and it's yours. That night I turned off the lights and locked up. Dean waved at me through the window of the coffee shop across the street. One of my girls texted to remind me the flower delivery was coming at 5. My father texted to ask if I'd be around for our Sunday call. All of it completely ordinary. And I love that it's ordinary. It is not the life Grant promised me on that back porch on Christmas Eve, and it is not the life Renee tried to take. It's the one I made with these 2 hands, in a town I picked off a map, because nobody there knew my name. For most of my life, I believed that a woman's greatest happiness was being chosen, really chosen, without hesitation, by somebody who'd know her hand in the dark. It took a blindfold, a lawn full of guests, and 1,000 miles of highway to understand that another person's choice was never going to determine what I was worth. On my wedding day, the man I loved walked right past me and took my best friend's hand. And it took me 2 more years and a bakery in Michigan to make the last and most important choice of my life. I chose myself, and I would do it again.